Okay, so hello, welcome to my YouTube channel. This is Michelle and we are working on IB English. We started this channel a while ago for the strikes, but basically now we are all off school with the coronavirus as well. So if you've stumbled across our content, I hope it's useful. And if you're one of my students, I hope it's useful as well, obviously, because it's just designed for you. Okay, so basically we are going to get started and we are going to be talking about cartoons. Now, we looked at a cartoon by Lisa Donnelly, which is a body of work, and we're going to think about how we can actually analyse it today. So if you're one of my students, please take notes because I'm going to offer you a framework of how you can do this. And this is really important because it comes up in your IB paper 1. You could potentially have a cartoon to analyse, but also because you could do this for your IO, which is coming up as well. So in terms of approaching this in a kind of methodical, thorough and comprehensive way, this is going to be really helpful. Okay, so the cartoon that I'm actually going to use for this is one that I showed my students yesterday, which is this one by Lisa Donnelly, which I've also got my students here, which is this one. Can everyone see it? I showed you this one yesterday. Okay, cool. So it's by Lisa Donnelly, and basically we are going to approach this in quite a sort of systematic fashion. And so my suggestion would be to take notes of the process and what we address, and then we're going to replicate that a little bit later. Okay, so the first thing that I want to think about is how I'm going to deconstruct this cartoon. And the first thing I'm going to do is literally think about the people, what kinds of people there are in the image, and literally what are they doing. The second thing I'm going to think about are the physical objects, what physical things are included in the image, and do they stand for anything or symbolize anything. Also, I'm going to consider the debatable issue because cartoons generally are there to provoke, aren't they? They're there to make us think about something and to consider an issue that from a different angle that maybe we haven't considered before. Then I'm going to think about the artist's technique. Is it abstract? Is it iconic? Is it realistic? Are there caricatures? Are there exaggerated features? So in a drawing, if I have here, on one side I have absolutely realistic, and on here I have absolutely caricature or cartoonish. Where on this scale is this going to be? Okay, so this is sort of a cartoon continuum that we're looking at. I'm going to be thinking about humour. What kinds of techniques are there? Is it ironic? Is it a parody? Is it a satire? Is it understatement? Is it black humour? Is it morbid humour? Is it sick? Is it a juxtaposition of things? Are there analogies or are there allusions to other things? So that's kind of the humour technique, and all of this combines on a sort of matrix that we're looking at. Another thing that we're going to be thinking about is the artist's purpose. What is the artist's purpose in the issue, and what basically is the call to action, because they're always going to want to get us to do something or think about something. And so when we're considering if we understand the text, if we understand the cartoon, we have to understand that as well. Not literally, do I understand what I see, but do I understand the intent behind it? So that's going to be really important as well. Okay, so what's the call to action? What are they asking us to consider or to think about or to change our minds about? And the last bit is, agree or disagree. What side of the debate are you or on other people on generally? So that's the framework that I'm going to use to start with. Okay, so I'm going to start with people. So what kinds of people are there in the image? There are 3 people in the image. Obviously there's a nuclear family, sort of the classic nuclear family. There's a mother who's wearing an apron and she's in the kitchen cooking, and there's a father who's reading a newspaper, and there's a small child. So obviously this is a very kind of stereotypical, conventional projection of a family. And they're doing stereotypical, conventional things. The man is reading the newspaper, although he is in the cartoon, in the frame of the cartoon, looking out at us. The mother is also looking out at us, and the child is sideways on, looking up at her mother, who is stirring a pot. In terms of physical items that are in the cartoon, we obviously have a kitchen, there's glasses, there's a table, there's a newspaper, everything that would automatically make us think of a sort of a typical family, whatever that is, a stereotypically family environment. In terms of a debatable issue, the contentious or controversial issue that the cartoon comments on is basically the idea of feminism and the way that feminism has been misconstrued through the ages, and somewhere in the mix, feminism was turned into a kind of insult, because the child is saying to her mother, some kids at school called you a feminist, Mom, but I punched them out. And so obviously, the idea of the word feminism is that it's an insult. And so what the controversial issue that the cartoon is asking us to comment on is this idea of, is the word feminism actually an insult? And if not, how did it become one? And what's an appropriate reaction in terms of confronting that stereotype or that misunderstanding of what feminism actually is? In terms of the technique, I would say that it is on a continuum. The line drawings are very simple. So in terms of realism on one side and sort of cartoon on the other side, it's line drawings, they're very simplistic. Features are exaggerated in the sense that the nose is a symbolic nose, it's not an actual nose on all of the characters. There is sort of, I think it's watercolor shading behind, and they're very much representations rather than attempts to replicate reality. The humour technique, I would say there's a lot of different ones. I think there's a lot of juxtaposition, there's irony, because the child is speaking to her mother and calling her a feminist, but at the same time she is in fact in her sort of a quite traditional role, cooking in the kitchen. And this sends quite an interesting message as well, because the idea behind this is that you can be a feminist and still have a traditional role. The point is about choice. So if that is her choice, then that is absolutely valid, and she can be a feminist and still be a traditional housewife, which is quite interesting, particularly because the idea of the writing underneath it, the text, is that being a feminist is an insult in some degree. It's also quite interesting, there's some irony in there as well, because we have a little girl who has actually used violence in order to get her point across as a response to the perceived insult of her mother. That's quite an interesting irony as well. In terms of what the artist's biased perspective would be, I think it's clear that the artist is trying to ask us to think about or show her perspective that feminism is not a dirty word, and that it is funny and it's interesting and it's ironic that it's somehow become a dirty word, that while rejecting stereotypes of gender in the past, we have now come around to have other stereotypes about roles in the present, which is very ironic in itself. So this cartoon is really a satire on that particular relationship between the way that society first of all perceived women, and now the way that society perceives feminists, because they're equally as one-dimensional and not very complex. So I think in terms of the side of the debate that I am on, I would agree with the artist. I think it's ironic, but at the same time it needs to be addressed. The fact that feminism is so desperately misunderstood by young people, particularly young women, and that people are rejecting the label feminism because they really don't understand it. And so I would agree with that, and I would suggest that the artist is saying that feminism is about choice and about complexity, and not about either being a stereotypical traditional woman or man, or being a stereotypical feminist, because both of them are as limiting and as one-dimensional as one another. So that's how I would analyse that particular comic. I would also extend this a little bit and think about a few other items that might be interesting to note down. I would think about the panel and the way that space is organised. And so, again, interestingly, we have, in terms of the height of the people in the cartoon itself, we have the man on the visual level slightly above the woman, and then we have the woman, and then we have the child down below. And so this also gives us some indication of irony inside, because she is painting a traditional picture of a nuclear family. So that panel is quite interesting. There is no frame, and so that gives it quite a contemporary, modern feeling. Sometimes framed panels in comics or in cartoons can seem quite traditional or quite retrospective or kind of retro, whereas this one feels quite contemporary, along with the colour wash as well. There isn't a lot of blank space in the actual frame itself, but that's something that we can also consider when we're deconstructing cartoons. There is blank space, I suppose, towards the back of the cooker on the left-hand side. In terms of the angle, we can look at the angle of the expression. I suppose the two adults seem to be looking out at us as readers, and the child seems to be looking up at her mother. So those angles are quite interesting as well, because this gaze invites us to respond to them. They're inviting us into their space, which creates sort of a perspective of inclusion, that we are being included into this conversation. In terms of symbols or emanata, I don't think there really is any in this. There's no emanata, which are those little lines that go out to indicate movement. You often see them in multi-panel comics, but in this particular one there aren't any. And there's no speech bubbles, and so that's quite interesting as well. Having the dialogue underneath the frame is quite interesting, because sometimes when the dialogue is underneath, it's not actually coming from the person inside the cartoon, it's coming from a narrator of some kind. But this is interesting because it is actually the child. And there's no response, and that is really interesting as well. What could the response be? What should the response be? And so while the two adult figures in the cartoon are looking at us, they're inviting us to consider a response as well. Is it shock? Is it surprise? Is it offense? Is it bewilderment? What do we feel, and what would we feel in that particular position as well? And so this one line is kind of a punchline, isn't it? We're supposed to giggle, we're supposed to laugh, we're supposed to be a bit confused by this. And as I said, there's also a third way that we can sort of look at this, and we can consider sort of a continuum of cartoonification. Here we can look at it and say, is it simple? Is it complex? It's quite, in terms of the actual drawings, the drawing's quite simple, isn't it? It's not a very complex drawing in the sense that there is detail, but it's very representative detail. It's cartoonified, it's not realistic. Is it subjective or objective? I'd say maybe quite subjective. Is it universal or specific? Again, it's not talking about one specific situation in terms of gender relationships. It's talking about a universal situation, which is that young people often do not classify themselves as feminists, and the perception of the term has become quite distorted. And is it abstract, concrete? It's quite abstract in terms of, not abstract, it's quite probably in the middle somewhere there in terms of the drawing itself. We can identify what everything is. There's nothing confusing. We know that the glasses are the glasses. And so what the artist is trying to do here is communicate this idea of slight bewilderment and slight challenge towards the conception of feminism in current day. Okay, so this is one way that we can look at cartoons, and it's something that we'll be doing quite a lot of as we move through the next couple of weeks in terms of individual panel cartoons or multi-frame cartoons. Okay, all right, thank you very much. I hope that was useful, and goodbye.